In mid-January, Britain became the first country to publicly announce it would send its own top-of-the-line-ish tanks to Ukraine. After Britain said it would send 14 Challenger 2s, other countries finally joined in as well. But what will all those tanks and other recently promised armored vehicles do for Ukraine? How might they be used and how might they fare in the war? As the war rages on, Eurasian markets are in constant turmoil. Energy and housing prices are at historic highs. That caused even stocks and bonds to lose up to 25% in 2022. Masterworks, sponsoring this video, can help with investing. Major banks are offering advisory services for buying fine art. Funds have increased their holdings of alternative assets to over 30%. Thanks to Masterworks, even small investors can join in and invest in real physical paintings qualified with the SEC. Masterworks have over 600,000 users and their results from last year are impressive. Almost $26 million was handed back to investors from 11 paintings sold. Each sale returned over 9% net. Many Masterworks paintings sell out in less than an hour, but using the link below, your account will be given special access. Onto with our video now. Why have NATO countries only recently started pledging their own armor? Not just the tanks, but also infantry fighting vehicles, like Marders, Bradleys and CV-90s, also promised this past January. Up until January, only tanks sent to Ukraine came from Eastern European countries, which still had Soviet-compatible tanks. Some 350 were sent so far, mostly T-72s, with up to 90 more Czech tanks to come fairly soon. Joining them were some 245 various BMP variants, which are infantry fighting vehicles. Sure, NATO countries sent lots of vehicles of their own design, but those were all various armored cars or very old armored personnel carriers, like the Vietnam-era M113. So, what changed? Well, back in September and October, Russia seemed like it was on the ropes. It was losing a lot of territory. And it's possible that to the NATO countries, a cascading political event in Russia seemed possible, stemming from those losses. Perhaps they hoped for Moscow's political support for the whole war disintegrating. Or perhaps it was believed a mass rout of Russian troops would be triggered in other areas as well. That did not happen. Instead, Putin seems to have doubled down, announcing mobilization in Russia in September. As December came and went, the front line became increasingly frozen. With no further successes from Ukraine's side, with ever-increasing Russian troop numbers, and with Ukrainian losses around Bakhmut, NATO countries finally changed their tune. All those vehicles they sent earlier have not proved to be enough. It's plausible many of those were neutralized in the meantime anyway, so a fresh wave of vehicle pledges is being organized. But since by now most of ex-Soviet stocks within NATO have been spent, different kinds of vehicles are being promised. What will those NATO vehicles face? Well, infantry and missiles and artillery, but also sometimes Russian tanks. Before the war, Russia's most numerous tank was by far the T-72B3 variant. It's basically the old T-72B from Soviet times, but completely refurbished and equipped with modern subsystems, munitions and add-on armor. It is only normal that, even according to the Oryx photo archive, with all its shortcomings, the B3 variants have seen highest casualties. So due to their numbers, we'll do a little comparison of the Russian T-72B3 with soon-to-come NATO tanks, excluding Abrams, which will be covered in another video. While top-of-the-line NATO tanks in active service are better than Russia's most common tank, most tanks that are en route to Ukraine are not as capable. Most of those do not offer a separate second thermal sensor for the commander. They only feature one thermal sight for the gunner, just like the baseline Russian B3. What's more, while the Russian B3 have French-based second-generation thermal sights, most of the recently promised NATO tanks come from stored stocks and feature only first-generation thermal sensors. Even the German Leo 2A6 still have first-generation thermals for the gunner. The other older Leos might be sent as are, or modernized before reaching Ukraine, which would take time. On one hand, they might not be as competitive as they could be, and on the other, those older Leos might not reach Ukraine before spring offensives. First-generation thermals can recognize tank targets at around 1 to 2 kilometers away, while the B3 sensor can do the same at little over 3 kilometers, while being less susceptible to fog and smoke. It has to be pointed out that a lot of other Russian tanks in Ukraine, like the T-72B and BA, do not have any thermal sensors whatsoever. Curiously though, some of the even older T-72Ms taken out of storage have been refurbished to use a basic thermal sight for the gunner. Good sights and fire control computer are essential on a modern battlefield. Those enable a tank to spot the target from greater distances, even when obscured by smoke or foliage or during the night. Spotting an enemy RPG or ATGM team hiding in the bushes in time might be crucial to tank survival. Having a modern fire control computer capable of taking many variables into account and providing accurate shots while moving can also be important, especially when trying to move fast to break through enemy lines, or when trying to react to an enemy breakthrough by a flanking counterstrike of their own. Various models of ATGMs might threaten tanks in Ukraine. The Russian army likely has thousands of Kornet missiles on the battlefield, which are advanced enough to push through more than 1,000 millimeters of steel, defeating most tanks used or promised to be used in Ukraine. Russia made many more such missiles, but due to their high price tag, Russian army had procured only 750 by 2012, and likely more by today. Kornet is a pretty advanced laser beam rider missile, and its range is 5,500 meters. While there's an even newer Kornet M out there, their numbers are still too small to make a serious presence on the battlefield. Perhaps a much more widespread threat would be Conquer's M, which was still procured by the Russian army in the hundreds annually during the last decade. It's basically an analog to modern US STO variants. Its 4-kilometer range and ability to push through some 800 millimeters of steel behind an era cover is still likely enough to defeat most tanks that Ukraine has or might get. Mind you, these penetration values in our video are usually estimates. They should not be taken at face value. Of course, armor thickness is not uniform. It's always about chances and likelihoods when it comes to tank hits. Head-on Leopard 2A4, the variant that will likely be the most numerous Leo variant in the long run, has some chance to withstand some hits. Its turret cheeks, for example, might be able to deal even with Conquer's M hits totally perpendicular to them. But both the gun mantlet and the entire front of the tank's hull would not withstand such hits. Granted, a small percentage of hits usually reach the hull compared to the turret, so in the end it's likely over 2/3 of such frontal shots might be survivable for Leopard 2A4s. Challenger 2 is similar to the extent that, like pretty much all tanks, it doesn't have all of it armored the same way, though its turret cheeks are likely so armored that even the more modern Russian Kornet missile might not penetrate. But as usual, the gun mantlet and especially the hull are likely candidates for penetration. Challenger 2 was seen in action with additional era armor on the lower half of its frontal hull though, as well as side skirts plated in such era armor. If Ukraine gets such armored variant, that would certainly help against various ATGMs and RPGs, even when attacked from the sides. But talking about armor protection is a bit futile, because in a war, tanks and other vehicles will inevitably get threatened not just from the front, but from other angles as well. Or some lucky shot will reach a weak part of the armor. Some of those Leopards and Challengers will inevitably get hit. A modern ATGM hitting the side of any tank today will punch through. Sometimes the damage may not be great. Maybe another crew will command the same tank after a repair within weeks. So talking about Russian tanks fighting Leopards and Challengers may sound interesting, but it will not be decisive. Heck, it will likely not even happen often. With these numbers of NATO tanks pledged so far, it's more likely those tanks will not get to face a Russian tank, but will instead get hit by various ATGMs, RPGs in an ambush, by tank mines, by munitions launched from drones, and even by loitering drones themselves. While the Russian Lancet drone doesn't have a powerful warhead, if it manages to hit the right part of the tank's turret, it can damage it so much that it becomes essentially neutralized. Indeed, back after World War II, there were studies trying to compile threats to tanks. Not a lot of tanks were lost to enemy tank fire. Today, AT gun losses and self-propelled gun losses would likely be replaced by ATGMs, and bazookas are essentially RPGs. While not a lot of tanks were lost to aircraft in World War II, today's various drones, planes and helicopters would likely lower the 25% of tanks lost to enemy tanks even further. And these statistics don't even include losses due to mechanical failures, terrain, etc. Another US study put those at 13% of all losses. Also, Oryx Photo Archive suggests a third of all Russian tanks were lost due to being captured. That may or may not be true, but certainly the real figure is likely not negligible, especially when one side manages to surprise the enemy and advance quickly. When all those percentages are added, tanks lost to enemy tank fire may drop to just 15% or less. And even the mass barrage of artillery might damage tanks. The US Army tested artillery against tanks in the Cold War and concluded 155mm artillery is more damaging than they thought. With today's drone-corrected artillery, it's plausible that an artillery battery could immobilize a tank or two in a tank company if they get timely and precise firing information. As said, tank-on-tank fights including NATO tanks will be fairly rare, but they will still sometimes happen. Statistically speaking, most common tank opponent will be the T-72B3. Its base armor is still that of the T-72B, which is behind the times, but its ERA modules overlaid over the base armor are quite modern and potent. Enough so that if a tank round from the Challenger and Leo happens to hit the frontal part of the B3 which has those modules, the NATO round will likely not penetrate. Those generally cover the same parts of the tank as especially bulky armor on Western tanks. Difference being that Western passive armor will be able to withstand multiple hits to a small area, while the reactive armor plates on the B3 will be depleted after a single hit. After that happens, subsequent penetrator rounds that manage to hit the same spot, for both the Challenger and Leo, are likely to penetrate even the turret of the T-72B3. Of course, hitting the same spot twice isn't going to happen often. Tanks will eventually disengage and get fresh armor plates. For the Challenger 2, the likely ammo it will use is the export market-oriented L-28 tungsten penetrator dart. Its head-on penetration value from 2 km away is usually stated to be around 600 to 700 mm of steel. Both A4 and A5 Leos use the same gun. Germany is likely to give Ukraine DM-53 penetrators, likely penetrating up to 700 mm at same conditions. All the NATO tanks pledged will use roughly 20 years old tech for their gun rounds. But A6 Leos do use a longer gun, enabling the same round to go faster and penetrate a bit more. Challengers, Leos and Abrams all use manual loading of rounds, which can be quicker when the loader crew member is rested and the tank is not going over rough terrain, but it can also be slower during a protracted battle in less than ideal conditions. While manual loading has its other pros and cons, the Challenger 2 brings another challenge with it. It has a unique rifled barrel, and its ammo is not NATO standard one, as opposed to Leo 2's gun, which can use rounds originally made for Abrams or French Leclerc tank, for example. Anyway, as said, tank-on-tank clashes will not be numerous. Of course, there's other issues that could be considered, like NATO's tank's weight. Challenger 2 weighs 65 metric tons, but with different additional armor modules, that can grow to 75 metric tons. Such figures might be problematic not just for infrastructure like certain small bridges and roads, but also for traversing regular ground. During the rainy season, some parts of the soil might turn into such mud that even a tank won't be able to go through. Leopard 2 is a bit better there, exerting smaller ground pressure, especially if Challenger 2 has its additional ERA armor modules installed. Furthermore, Leo has 7 smaller wheels, rather than Challenger's 6 bigger ones per side, which means less ground pressure per wheel, as tracks can't always be fully rigid. Both the Challenger and Leopard have diesel engines, but Leo has a more powerful one. When weight differences are added, it means Leo has quite an upper hand on the Challenger when power-to-weight ratio is concerned. Such a weak figure was somewhat compensated for with a more complex transmission, which has 6 forward gears, compared to Leo's 4. But Leo still outruns the Challenger in top speed. A Leo's more powerful engine and less fuel carried mean that Challenger has a slight edge in autonomy. But what would really help Ukraine is not the sole fact they got some Challenger and Leopard 2 tanks, or even Bradley and Marder infantry fighting vehicles. What would help Ukraine is if they got many such vehicles in a short time span, not a few hundred, but likely 1,000 within half a year. If Ukraine ever gets that and the training infrastructure is set up outside Ukraine so 1,000 crew sets are also trained in the same time span, then a crucial mass of potent vehicles could be assembled on the battlefield. That might be enough to break through certain Russian lines, once other systems have done their part. like long-range strike systems, paralyzing Russian support beforehand. Everything really needs to be sent as part of a broader, balanced plan. 500 tanks, for example, would benefit most from even more than said number of infantry fighting vehicles, and those would all benefit most from hundreds more drones to scout enemy positions and hundreds more artillery pieces to pin them down as the armor is advancing. All that is of course very speculative. The initially announced vehicle figures may not be enough to make a meaningful impact on the battlefield on their own, if not followed up by more and more vehicles. Take the IFVs for example. With the armor numbers promised, those IFVs will rarely get to be used as the US Army is using them, meaning to go fast and carry infantry, crossing perhaps dozens of kilometers during penetration or counterattack maneuvers. The front line is simply too short, too densely populated by enemy troops, and too fortified for that. With the current numbers, it's likely even IFVs like the Bradley will serve more as an additional sensor and gun platform, to be held a few hundred meters behind the very front line populated by infantry and foot, in the trenches and so on. Those IFVs will still be good as they will be able to bring supplies and firepower to the front line, but unless even more vehicles are sent soon, they likely won't be used to be as mobile as they could be. And the same will likely apply to tanks. Instead of a large formation of tanks and other vehicles charging to flank an enemy, there will be no opportunity to flank. Tanks will be used as support sensor and firepower platforms, just like the IFVs, but with heavier guns and longer reach. Still, all those IFVs and tanks are decently armored against artillery, which is very important, as artillery has been causing a lot of casualties in this war. Combined with decent sensors and guns in the same package, even a more stationary vehicle will help Ukraine. So will Ukraine ever get hundreds of NATO-designed tanks? That's quite possible, but there are bottlenecks. First, the logistics support for those tanks may be one of the reasons why not many tanks will be sent at once. Such heavy machines need specialized maintenance depots, much like NATO artillery maintenance shops in Poland, Slovakia and Germany, which are already servicing NATO artillery pieces. Those are periodically sent back out of Ukraine to get repaired, before being sent once again into Ukraine. It might take time to establish such depots to be able to service a fleet of 500 or more NATO tanks. Germany might even be too far away, as ferrying vehicles more than 1,000 kilometers back and forth might be quite wasteful. Yes, some maintenance can be done on site in Ukraine, but that's usually small-scale stuff. When an important piece on a tank breaks down, like the transmission, or when armor and the gun need to be repaired or replaced, vehicles will need to be sent back. The other bottleneck might be sheer numbers of tanks available. And their Leos do hold up better than Challengers, as more are held stored around Europe. Even if Britain ends up keeping fewer Challengers in its active duty force, which it announced before the war in Ukraine started, the stored total would top out at 140 tanks. In contrast to that, stored Leopards in NATO countries might number 450 to 500 vehicles. Mind you, all the stored Leos are the older A4s, which is why we use that variant as the benchmark. Due to the urgency and bad condition of those stored tanks, some countries like Germany have opted to send their active duty latest and greatest variants. The Abrams tank we'll explore in greater detail in another video, as said. When it comes to infantry fighting vehicles, CV-90 is perhaps the least available. Sweden might have already pledged most of its stored reserve, and almost all the other users have those vehicles only in their active duty force. Over 300 Marders should still be stored in Germany, but due to their age and needed refurbishment, it's very questionable just how many could be delivered anytime soon. US Bradley is by far the most available, with some 2,000 of its IFV variant vehicles stored. So out of the vehicle types currently pledged by NATO, Bradley and Leo 2 do seem like decent choices to double down upon, for commonality and logistics purposes, but politics will as usually likely throw a wrench into the process of sending what's best in best numbers for Ukraine. Abrams tank might be an even better choice, but again, more about that in another video. And of course, if the news warrant it and we find the time, other unplanned videos may get made as well. With our production pipeline needing a few weeks to make a video, it's sometimes hard to follow all this flurry of news on Ukraine. but do subscribe and definitely hit that notification bell button.